actually correctly put it, it is not something that you just do overnight. It is a process, it is an intricate procedure. Kenya is among, I think, the first country that will actually go down that road, and it will, most countries actually will be watching to see the steps that we will take. But the process is enshrined in the Rome Statute. It's very clear. It takes 12 good months
A
to
year.
do so. Yes.
Okay, so even as you say, this is a process that Kenya has initiated. Kenya has not essentially pulled out of the Rome Statute, right?
Yes.
But then the president said he suspend any links, cooperation, and assistance, and the ICC has warned of consequences, so to speak. And of course, those consequences will be there because Kenya is still a signatory to the Rome Statute. What sort of consequences would be there for Kenya if before Kenya withdraws from the Rome Statute, it ceases cooperation and assistance, giving any assistance to the court? What are the consequences?
Linda, the consequences, I would like to put it this way, is not only going to affect Kenya just because we are still signatories of a signatory of the Rome Statute. The world is one as it is, and that is the philosophy behind the Rome Statute by itself. But more importantly, even if today we were past the 1 year particular period and we were actually not signatories, we still have a duty to cooperate with the International Criminal Court, basically because it still has jurisdiction over what happened in Kenya when we were signatories, such that pulling out successfully doesn't actually amount to removing the authority or the jurisdiction that the
In other words,
International
it
Criminal
doesn't
Court,
affect the ongoing cases.
it does not affect the ongoing cases, and more so for the three particular individuals
Yes.
who are wanted for interfering with the
Yeah,
prosecution's case. But more importantly, it's also good for people to know that the case against the president and the deputy president have not been terminated. Those cases are still pending. Actually, what the court said is that is akin to what we have in Kenya. We call it SOG. The cases have been stood over generally. And
Okay, please explain stood
Yes,
over generally.
I'm actually going to delve into that,
Yeah.
such that a case, as long as it has, we have stages in criminal process, such that a prosecutor is allowed, or the court can actually suspend a case, and it can be indefinite for reasons. And in this particular instance, the issue is that when evidence comes to the fore, because the prosecution indicated the evidence that we have, the evidence that we know exists,
Insufficient.
but unfortunately the government is not cooperating for us to get these pieces of evidence. Secondly, they say that some witnesses have been interfered with, and more importantly, some of these witnesses fear to testify against particular individuals because of the power that they wield in the country. And that is a mechanism that the court has actually used, such that in future, if there is a change in terms of what is happening at this particular stage, the prosecutor has the right to bring back these particular cases. And for me, this is the bigger picture, if you ask me, that the president is looking at. Because that is a hanging rope that is always there for him and the deputy. As they were celebrating, that is what they did not tell their followers. And maybe that is why the issues that, in terms of blaming the opposition, will still be there. Because the cases still penned. They have not been terminated. Now, back to your question in terms of the consequences. First of all, it is very, very unfair for the president to initiate this particular process without first getting the feel of the country itself. Because you cannot make the decision for all the people, such that you may be elected president today because of the systems that we have. However, it doesn't mean that your view automatically becomes the view of the entire populace. And that is why I believe Senior Counsel Orengo has indicated in such a delicate issue, there may be need to go for a referendum, because the repercussions will be dire, and it will not only affect a particular section of people or a particular section of others, it will affect the entire country. And this is in the form of sanctions, first of all. Sanctions will be placed upon the country. It will affect the economy of this particular country, whether we like it or not. And we are not a country that exists in isolation. As you have seen, our president and the deputy and other ministers always go abroad. They come back with what they call as goodies. That will stop. We cannot exist in isolation, and we will really suffer. My take as an advocate is, one, we should rethink this particular process. It has already been initiated, yes. We have our representatives in these particular houses. Let our representatives know the feel from their particular
Come back to
constituents.
the
Yes,
ground.
come back to the ground. Relay, not what they think, not what their party, the sponsoring party thinks, but what the Mwananchi there thinks. Because this is something that is going to affect us and affects our children and in terms of posterity. It is a decision that we don't need to make just because of what has happened yesterday, because there's a bigger picture to look into.
Okay. So here's the thing. First of all, the president says suspend any links, cooperation and assistance, so put that aside. While at the prayer rally in Nakuru, he said no other Kenyan will walk the road that he and his deputy and the other suspects walked. So in terms of the three gentlemen, that is Walter Barasa, Paul Gisheru and Philip Bet, from a legal perspective, how should Kenya handle this?
From a
Because they are
legal
wanted by the International Criminal Court. The president says no other Kenyan will walk through this road. Of course, there will be consequences if Kenya does not hand them over. How should Kenya handle this?
First of all, and I've said it in another forum, it is very unfortunate that the president will be the first one to give such kind of an advice and direction. And I say this basically going into history. He was elected the head of state, and even before, but even after he was elected the head of state, he was required to cooperate. What did he do? He said, I will cooperate, despite pressure from almost all the other members of parliament in his own particular party. He came out and actually gave them a very big surprise when he said, I'm going to The Hague as a head of state. It doesn't matter that I'm the first head of state to actually...
I'll go.
Yes,
Whichever
I will
way,
go.
I will go.
I will cooperate. I will demonstrate my innocence if it means that. Then, if that is the road they walked, I believe he has led by example. For him, he should be the first one to tell these three gentlemen, if you are innocent, walk this road that I and my deputy walked. Clear your names. Let us come back here, do another celebration for you in Afra or any other place, and get it over and done with. But you cannot place the interests of these three particular individuals, and remember, they are not yet even adjudged guilty. It is a legal process, which is akin to what goes on in our courts, such that you put the interest of the entire nation, the entire over 40 million
yes.
persons, at the behest of only three people, to whom we are not taking them for to a slaughterhouse. There is due process, the same due process that they
That
went
all
through.
the 6 suspects
Exactly,
went
went through. It's the same due process
Okay.
that they should have gone through.
All
So
right.
for me, it's unfortunate, Linda.
You think it's
Yeah,
unfortunate?
it's very, very unfortunate, and that is not what I would say I would expect from leadership. The Attorney General, and if I may, is on record saying that Kenya will cooperate. Let the courts here, in terms of the extradition
You do
proceedings,
realize he's the legal advisor to the president, and the president is very categorical in his statement saying we need to cut all links, cooperation and assistance.
and that actually tells you a lot, Linda. He came out in public and said, for me, once the extradition process is over, and if they say these people should go to The Hague, they will be on the next plane going to The Hague. The president, who should be getting legal advice from this particular person who we are paying to actually give him legal advice, gives us a different kind of direction. It actually means legal advice is not coming from the person we are funding to give the president legal advice. And that's a very dangerous trend for this particular nation.
Okay. Duncan Okach, lawyer, thank you for staying with us on News Center. Stay with me for just a little bit,
Thank you.
because there's a different aspect that we need to look at. In as much as the president and the deputy went to Nakuru and there was lots of celebration, there's the aspect of the victims of the 2007-2008 post-election violence, some who are still hoping that at some point they will get justice. The High Court is this morning set to hear a public interest litigation case filed by 25 internal internally displaced persons with the assistance of 3 civil society organizations. This is a representative suit and covers all IDPs displaced during the 2007-2008 post-election violence in Eldoret, Kericho, Kisumu, Isiolo, Naivasha, Bungoma, Nakuru, Kisii, Trans Nzoia, Nyandarua, Meru, Mombasa, Nairobi, and Laikipia. The case, which was filed in 2011, has seen 6 witnesses testify on how the 2007-2008 post-election violence impacted negatively on their lives. The objective of this case is to establish that the government of Kenya violated its constitutional obligation to protect the citizens of Kenya during and after that violence. Great, let's cross over to the High Court and bring in Michelle Ngele. Michelle has been keeping an eye on this particular story for us. Michelle, 25 internally displaced persons are at the High Court that is set to hear that public interest litigation case filed by them. Have you gotten a chance to speak to any of them? What are they saying?
Good morning, Linda. Yes, I did have a chance to speak to some of these internally displaced persons. They were quite dismayed at the government, actually, because these are integrated internally displaced persons, and that means these are IDPs that found a way to stay with relatives or stay with friends, and therefore a way to integrate themselves back into society. But this all started back in 2011 when they filed this suit against the government. And back in 2012, there was a fund that was released to compensate victims of the 2007-2008 post-election violence. And each of the internally displaced persons was to get 400,000 shillings. But in the following year, in 2013, the then Minister for Devolution and Planning said that they were not planning to compensate integrated IDPs. And this is the bone of contention in this case here today, with the IDPs asking, why are they being sidelined by the government when they too were affected by the violence? They just chose to remain quiet about it and wait for compensation, Linda.
Okay, so here's the thing, Michelle. There has been a lot of talk about whether or not victims of the 2007-2008 post-election violence have indeed been compensated, the government giving different scenarios, at times saying all of them have been compensated, at times saying some of them have not. At the end of this whole process, what are they hoping to get?
Well, they're hoping to be compensated just like the rest, because at the end of the day, there are those who have been compensated by that fund that was to compensate IDPs, and some actually got that 400,000 shillings. But some of the integrated IDPs say, although some of them have been compensated, they've only been given 10,000 shillings or 15,000 shillings. So they're questioning the disparities on why the government chooses who to give more money and who to give less money. But then more issues are coming into this, because some are saying that they're being sidelined because they're viewed as opposition sympathizers, and therefore the government is not as keen on compensating opposition sympathizers. But that is just the views of some of the IDPs here. But remember, Linda, they're not only representing the internally displaced persons. This is a representative suit representing all victims of the post-poll chaos, including those who may have lost friends and relatives, and those who may have lost limbs, had physical injuries. And many of them are here today. Some have physical injuries that they have not been able to pay for in hospital. Some are waiting for compensation from, I spoke to some from the Kiambaa Church in Eldoret, and they lost wives and children there, and they're still waiting for the government to compensate them. And even after the ICC cases came to a close, they are hopeful that they will find justice in the Kenyan system.
Okay, here's the thing, Michelle. You remember when Deputy President William Ruto gave that address just after his case had been dropped by the International Criminal Court, and in as much as he thanked Kenyans for working with him and journalist Joshua Arap Sang, he was very categorical about post-election violence victims, and he said these are people who've walked a very difficult road and the government now needs to focus on them. How hopeful are they that A, the government is going to meet them halfway and give them the compensation that they need, and B, that there will be healing and reconciliation when all is said and done?
Well, they did speak specifically to the issue of the deputy president, and especially that Jubilee Thanksgiving prayer rally that took place in Nakuru Zafraha Stadium. And they mentioned, remember the Jubilee administration then, during that rally, had a few victims that were paraded, and these are victims that, according to the Jubilee government, had already received full compensation. But that is a fact that really angered some of the IDPs here today, because they're saying that those who were paraded by the government last week are people who are known to be conmen, and people who have been compensated as IDPs when indeed they were not affected by the post-poll chaos. And some of them, having received a full compensation, they say the government is using that as a means of fooling Kenyans into thinking that all IDPs have been compensated. But I did ask them, Linda, what should happen? Should we go to the next elections without some of them having been compensated? And they say it will be war, Linda, unfortunately. And they say that how can they even think of garnering the effort to go vote for a government that really has neglected them for the past 8 years or so. And while some of them are hopeful that they will be getting compensation from the government, following several promises from the president and his deputy themselves, there is only one judge handling this case since 2011, and that itself shows maybe a lack of dedication from the government's part, because that's why this case has taken so long, has dragged on for 8 years. And no one has been talking about these IDPs, even when the ICC cases are going on. And so it remains to be seen whether they indeed will get justice, or whether the promises being made by the government are just empty promises, Linda.
Michelle, tell me where you are. Can you see any of the IDPs anywhere close to you?
No, Linda, right now I'm just actually outside the court case. I'm in the courtroom, and they were just walking into the court to settle in. That case, the hearing is expected to begin any time now. And today is the final witness expected to take the stand. And this is actually the psychologist who's been working closely with these IDPs. And she's going to be talking about how this has affected them mentally. And that will be the last point of action from the point of the defense.
Wow, I'd love to hear what that psychologist will have to say in terms of the healing process. Actually, Michelle, the reason why I was asking you if you're close to any of them is because I wanted to ask them what they feel about this quote-unquote healing and reconciliation that everyone keeps talking about. Remember, the president is on record and he said the country has moved on. Let's now move on as a country. Let's put this behind us. So I wanted to look at it from the perspective of the victims, and I'll put you on the spot a little bit, Michelle. When you're speaking to some of the victims, how much healing has there been?
Well, Linda, when they recount their stories, you see them relieve the pain afresh. Some of them are really still just caught up in that period of the post-election violence. And some of them are really very angry, Linda, especially about these prayer rallies that you're talking about, because when the government speaks reconciliation, the victims here are saying reconciliation is a far-fetched idea, because for them, they still haven't been compensated. They're still living in the pain of the post-poll chaos, and they see no reason for the government to celebrate this period after the termination of the ICC cases. Some of them are angry at the ICC itself for failing to bring to book the perpetrators of the post-election violence. But some of them are also just downright angry at the government, Linda, for not taking enough action to ensure that the victims are compensated early enough.
Okay, so some of them are angry at the ICC for not being able to prosecute this particular case. Remember, at some point, Michelle, even the judges did not have a unanimous opinion on what to do with the victims. Should they be compensated? Should they not be compensated now the cases are being dropped? Let's see how this goes. Michelle Ngales, thank you so much for speaking to us from the High Court that is set to hear a public interest litigation case filed by 25 internally displaced persons. She's keeping an eye on that for us. Also this morning, we're waiting. Attorney General Githu Muigai is set to issue a statement declaring Kenya's position on the International Criminal Court. Here's the thing. The president has asked MPs to follow through two pending resolutions in both houses that ask his government to suspend any links, cooperation and assistance. In studio, I have Duncan Okach with me. I've been talking about the ICC and the implications of the decision by Kenya to pull out of the Rome Statute. Duncan, thank you for staying with me. And you've listened into that conversation that I've just had with Michelle.
Yes.
And you have IDPs in court seeking compensation. And of course, there has been talk of a local legal mechanism to sort of address the concerns of some of these people. Do you think enough has been done with respect to helping IDPs, compensating them, helping them to move on the healing and the reconciliation process?
Linda, that's a very good question, because ideally, the issue of justice should always focus more on the victims of this particular the said perpetrators. However, that has not been the case. And ideally, if you look at the Rome Statute, it actually places a lot of emphasis on compensation of these particular persons. However, and where the shortfall is, compensation is pegged on a conviction. When there is no conviction, then it is very hard to go down the road of compensation. And compensation is in the form of property or assets which are owned by these particular persons who have been convicted. The convictees are actually liquidated and used to pay, and also the state will be forced in that particular instance to compensate.
Hold on. So it makes it very difficult for victims of post-election violence to be compensated because there was no conviction in the cases at the ICC. Is that why the judges were non-committal on whether or not victims should be compensated?
Exactly, because there is no mechanism that will actually give the judges the right to force anyone now to compensate, not even the government. They don't. That is beyond their jurisdiction. If there was a successful conviction, then automatically the issue of compensation will follow. And that is why you see victims had their own lawyer there to also pursue their own interests. And
Fergal Gaina.
Yeah, and maybe that is the reason why, and even Deritu, the Kenyan lawyer, and that is why you saw there was a lot of unhappiness by this decision. The impact is way a lot, and especially on the victims. And back now to your question, the issue is, what have we done about these victims? And the reality, and everyone, even the blind person will actually tell you they have seen this. The government focus has been mostly on the accused, the people who had been accused. And even now, the government's focus is more on the three who are left. Ideally, we are 9 to 10 years way after the fact. If it was an issue of concentrating on these particular persons, we will not be talking about IDPs today. That will have been something that will have been, we will have dealt with it. It will have been history.
Yeah.
However, and it is very interesting to see that now, after these cases have actually been stood over, then ideally the government is coming all out. I had the State House spokesperson, Manoa Esipisu, actually indicating that now they are very willing to resettle and to compensate all victims of the post-election violence. My take is, why now? Was the money not there? Are we
was
getting
the
commitment? And that is exactly where the ball actually sticks. The commitment was not there. And even now, as we say, we are going to settle them. We are saying we are going to compensate them, but on the other hand, we are saying we've moved on. We've moved on. We don't want to deal with those issues.
So we're sort of contradicting
So we are
ourselves.
contradicting our positions, and it is very painful for a person who lost someone to actually see this. And I always tell people, Linda, with your permission, if we are to say that we have moved on, that should not come from either me or you, unless we are victims. Let it come from these victims. Let the person who is dealing with them there get to hear from them saying, us, we have moved on.
Yeah,
but
fine.
not me coming from the studio saying, we've moved on, we are so okay.
Very well put. Duncan Okach, lawyer, speaking to us this morning on the International Criminal Court and the process that has now been initiated by the Kenyan government to pull out of the Rome Statute. Here's the thing, people. This morning, we're expecting Attorney General Githu Muigai to issue a statement declaring Kenya's position on the International Criminal Court. In the same breath, the High Court is this morning hearing a public interest litigation case filed by 25 internally displaced persons. Those are our top stories this morning. We thank you for staying with News Center. Remember, these are developing stories. So here's the thing. When the Attorney General starts speaking at that press briefing, of course, we'll cross over. And at some point, we'll go back to Michelle Ngela just to listen into what will be said at the High Court. She says there's a psychologist in the court as well who will sort of narrate on the impact the 2007-2008 had on the victims of the post-election violence. So you have lots to watch out for in the next hour and a half. This is a 2-hour show. All right, people, we're taking a short break. We'll be back. Stay with us.